To recreate this dashboard using Tableau's Superstore data, we'll start by building a background with rounded corner containers. We'll then create KPI cards to display sales and order metrics, and an orbit chart with rounded ends to represent progress. We'll use a radial chart to break down sales by category. And to break down sales even further, we'll create a rounded bar chart for subcategory, featuring multicolored gradient bars with triangle tips on the ends. To show the trend for sales, we'll build a gradient area chart with custom circle markers and a start and end date filter. And for order details, we'll build a table that has frozen grand totals at the bottom. That way users don't have to scroll to see the totals. And we'll also add this search bar so users can search for information that's not in the table, like a customer name or region. And lastly, we'll include these interactive tabs that act as filters for the worksheet. So we can filter for one segment or all segments. And the color of these tabs are responsive to show which value is selected. To connect to the Superstore dataset, I'll hit Connect to Data. And the sample dataset that comes with Tableau is under the Save Data Sources. You can see when I go to the Data Source tab that this table is made up of orders, people, and returns. And I'll start on a new worksheet to create the background. I want to use rounded corner containers for our background, so I'm going to create a calculated field called box and put 2 quotes in it. Then I'll drag this calculated field to the marks and make it a text. You can see when I hover over it, there's some text in there, so I'm going to go to the tooltip and remove everything that's in there. Then I'll right-click inside the box, go to Annotate, Area, and hit OK. And I want to change this from a standard view to the entire view. Then I'll right-click Format inside the box, and for shading, I'm going to choose a tan color, and I'll set this to 100%. And under corners, I'm going to choose Rounded. So that'll give us a basic background of a rounded corner container. But I also want to put all my charts within rounded corner containers. So I'll repeat that process again by right-clicking, going to Annotate, Area, and hitting OK. Then I'll drag and resize this box to position it where I want the chart to be. And I'll format this one to have blue shading at 100%. And I'll make the corners rounded. And I'll continue this process for all of the boxes until I have the layout that I want. I'll call this worksheet Background, and then I'll create a dashboard. For the dimensions of the dashboard, I'm going to change the size to be 1300 by 800. Then I'll change the object type to be floating and drag in our background worksheet. Then I'll hide the title, and I'll go to the Layout tab to change the position to be 0, 0, and the size to match the size of our dashboard. For the KPI cards, I created some boxes in Canva that have shadows on it. So I'll go to the Dashboard tab, and under Objects, I'll drag in an image. And I'll choose my first image, which is going to be a blue gradient box. And once I get this position where I want it to be, I'm going to do the same process by going to the Dashboard tab, dragging an image in, and choosing a file. And after I get these KPI boxes in, I'm going to drag a text box in so we can label the elements in our dashboard. So this first one I'll call Sales, and I'll change the font to be white, Tableau medium, size 15, and bold. And Sales is going to be for our KPI card, so I'll drag it to the first box. Then I'll copy and paste our Sales text box, edit the text, and call it Orders. And I'll repeat this process so that we have titles for all of the elements in our dashboard. The first element I'll add to this dashboard is an orbit chart representing the progress made towards a sales goal. So I'll create a new worksheet called Orbit-Sales. And to create an orbit chart, we need to first unionize our data. So I'll go to the Data Source tab, and I'll drag our order table under our original order table to union them together. This stacks the two tables on top of each other and duplicates the amount of rows we have. And you can see here on the right, it generated a field called Table Name. This will either contain orders or orders 1, depending on if it was the original table or the unionized table. So on the Orbit Sales worksheet, I'll pull Table Name in. That way we can see the values. Then I'll create a calculated field and call it Orbit-Points. In here I'll type if the table name contains 1, then 1, else 360. And using 360 will allow us to plot a circle. And I'll right-click on our Orbit Points field, go to Create, and choose Bins. I'll set the size of the bins to 1, but keep all the other settings the same. Then I'll create another calculated field for the x-axis. This will be the sine of the radians of the index. And I'll create another calculated field for our y-axis. This will be the cosine of the radians of the index. And because this orbit chart is representing the progress, I need to create a parameter to assign a goal. So I'll call this sales goal and change the current value to 3.5 million. Then I'll right-click and show the parameter on the worksheet. To calculate the progress that's been made towards this goal, I'll create another calculated field called Orbit%Complete. In here I'll type the window sum of the sales, which is our metric. Divide that by 2 since we union the data together, and then divide that by the sales goal parameter. So this will return the percent that's been made towards the sales goal. And the last calculated field we'll need for this is to determine the colors. So I'll call this Orbit Colors, and I'll say if the index divided by the window max of the index is less than our Orbit%Complete field, then 1, else 0. To build the structure of the orbit chart, I'll start by removing our table name field. And because I named these all with orbit, I'm going to search orbit within our fields. I'll move X into the columns and Y into the rows. Then I'll move the points bin into the marks. I'll right-click on our Orbit X field, go to Compute Using, and choose the points bin. And I'll do the same thing for Y. And now you can see we have the circle shape. But these are currently open circles. So under the marks, I'm going to change it from shape to a circle. To apply the coloring, I'm going to move the Orbit Colors field into the marks, right-click, go to Compute Using, and choose the points bin. Then I'll right-click again and make it discrete. And now I can change this to a color. Using the legend, I'll edit the colors, and a new trick I found is if you double-click on the color, you can change it directly within Tableau without having to use your preferences. So I'll do the same thing for the 1. And since 1 represents the portion of the sales goal that's already completed, I'll set its color to white. To increase the size of our orbit chart, I'll use the size slider in the marks. And I also want to include the actual percent completed. So in the rows, I'll type 0. Then under the second mark I've created, I'm going to change it from a circle to text. And I'll remove what we currently have in there. Instead, I'll drag our Orbit%Complete field into the second mark. Then right-click, go to Compute Using, and choose Cell. And change it from a detail to a text. I'll right-click, go to Format, And under numbers, I'll change this to a percentage with no decimals. Then I'll right-click on one of our rows and make this a dual axis. That way we can get the percent complete inside our orbit chart. Under text in the second mark, I'm going to edit the text and make the font white, Tableau medium, size 12, and bold. For formatting, I'll remove all of the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'm going to remove the shading of the worksheet. Under borders, I'll remove the row divider and the column divider. And under lines, I'll remove the grid lines and the zero lines. On a dashboard, I'll add our Orbit Sales worksheet. I'll hide the title and get rid of the parameter and legend. Then I'll resize our orbit chart so it fits in our KPI box. And now we have an orbit chart that shows the percentage of progress that's been made towards the sales goal that we set. For orders, I'm going to set up a similar orbit chart. So I'm going to take our Orbit Sales worksheet and duplicate it. And I'll call this one Orbit Orders. And since orders is going to have a different goal than our sales, I'm going to create a parameter for our order quantity goal. And for this one, I'll set the current value to 90,000. And we can use a lot of fields from our previous orbit chart, but we do need to duplicate our Orbit Complete field. I'll edit that field and rename it so it's about the order quantity. Then I'll replace sales with our quantity field. And instead of the sales goal, I'll put in the order quantity goal parameter. And the percent complete field is being used to determine the colors, so I also need to duplicate our orbit color field. And I'll edit this one so it's about the order quantity. So instead of our orbit percent complete, I'm going to put in our order quantity field for the percent complete. Then under the first mark, I'll replace our orbit colors field with our new field for quantity. I'll right-click, go to Compute Using, and choose the points bin. I'll right-click again and make it discrete. Under the second mark, instead of our percent complete for sales, I'll drag in our percent complete for orders. Then I'll right-click, go to Compute Using, and choose Cell. And for coloring, I'll double-click on a color in our legend. And since 0 will represent the part that we haven't completed yet, I'm going to make this an orange color. That way it matches our KPI card color. And for 1, the percent we have completed, I'll make this white. And on the dashboard, I'll add the Orbit Orders worksheet. I'll hide the title again and remove the parameter and legend. Then I'll resize it and position it similar to our sales orbit chart. So now we have 2 orbit charts that represent the sales and the order progress. I think it'd also be useful to see the actual amounts for sales and orders, so I'm going to add that to the KPI card. And to make it more efficient, I'm going to do this on one worksheet. So I'll call this KPI Values. Then I'll search for measures so I can pull the measure names into the columns and the measure values into the marks. I'll make the measure values a text in the marks. Then I'll remove all the measure values that's not sales and quantity. And since sales is our first KPI card, I'm going to move it before quantity. But it's kind of hard to read a number that big, so I'm going to right-click Format on the sales. And I'll change this to a custom currency in the millions. And we already have titles for the KPI card, so I'm going to right-click on the title and uncheck Show Header. For formatting, I'm going to change the font to a white color. Also make this size 12 font and Tableau semi-bold. Under alignment, I'm going to choose to align it on the left side. For shading, I'm going to remove the shading for the worksheet. And for borders, I'll remove the row divider. Then on the dashboard, I'll add our KPI Values worksheet. I'll hide the title, and I'll resize it so that the KPI values appear right below their titles, and I'll offset it a little bit to the right. And you may have noticed that these numbers are a little bit high for what the sales and orders should actually be. And that's because we union the table with itself, which duplicated the data. So to fix this, I'll go back to our KPI Values worksheet, and I'll bring table name into the filters and just choose one. And now that we have our sales and order KPI cards, I want to add another one to show the breakdown of sales by category. And I'll do this using a radial chart. To create a radial chart, we have to do the same thing we did with the orbit chart, where we duplicate the number of rows. So to do this, I'd go to the Data Source tab and drag orders under our order table. But since the data is already union, since we did it for the orbit chart, I'll go back to the radial chart worksheet, and I'll drag table name in so we can see the two tables that are stacked. And there are a few formulas that we'll need to create for a radial chart. So I'll create a calculated field, and I'll call this radial points. In here, I'll type if the table name contains 1, then 0, else 270. Then I'll right-click on our radial points, go to Create, and choose Bins. And I want the size of the bins to be 1, but all the other settings can stay the same. And since this radial chart is going to show the portion of sales for each category, I need to create a calculated field to sum up the sales for each category. And I'll call this Radial LOD because I want to ensure that the sum of sales is computed specifically for each category. And we can do this using an LOD or level of detail function. So holding fixed the category, I'll take the sum of sales. And typically when you build a radial chart, you want to rank the values. That way, the most outer ring of the radial chart shows the highest value. And as the rings move towards the center, they represent the lower values in descending order. In here, I'll do the rank unique of the negative sum of our radial LOD calculated field. So the rank unique ensures that if two categories have the same sum, they'll be assigned distinct ranks. And the negative sign will invert the sum, that way we can rank the values in descending order. And last, we'll need to create our X and Y axes so we can plot the points that we created. So I'll start off with our X axis, and this is going to be the sine of the index minus 1 multiplied by the window max of the max of pi divided by 180 and multiplied by the window max of the radial rank formula. And since the y-axis is going to be similar, instead of typing out all that again, I'm going to right-click on our x1 and duplicate it. Then I'll right-click and edit it and call it y. And for the y-axis, I just need to change out our sine with a cosine. Then to create the structure, I'll remove table name from our view. And I'll pull radial x into the columns and radial y into the rows. And to get the circular ring shapes, I need to pull our radial point spin into the marks. And I'll change the mark type from automatic to align. And I want the point spin to determine the path of the line. Then for the x-axis, I'll right-click, go to Compute Using, and choose the radial point spin. And I'll do the same thing for the y-axis. Now that we have our ring shape, I need to pull category into the marks so we can get 3 distinct rings for each category. So for the x-axis this time, I'll right-click, go to Edit Table Calculation, and for the radial rank, instead of the point spin, I'll choose the category. And I'll do the same thing for the y-axis. So I'll edit the table calculation, and for the rank, I'll choose category. To increase the size of our rings, I can use the size slider in the marks. And to change the color of all the rings, I'll use the color in the marks. But I want each ring to be a different color based on the category that it represents. So I'll change category in our marks to a color. Then I can edit the colors in the legend and assign a color to each of these categories. To add the category value to each ring, I'll drag category into the marks and make it text. But these category values are a bit long, so I'm going to create a calculated field to do an abbreviation of the categories. So I'll type if the category equals furniture, then whatever abbreviation I want to use for furniture. And I'll do that for all three values. I like to use an abbreviated field like this when I have limited space on my dashboard. So I'll drag our category abbreviated field in to replace our category field. And you can see the X and Y axis went red, and that's because I need to right-click, edit the table calculation, and instead of category, choose the category abbreviation field we created. And I'll do the same thing for the Y-axis. So now that we have our abbreviated categories in there, I don't like that they're on the bottom, and I want to move them to the start of the line. To do this, I'll go to the label, and for the marks to label, choose line ends. And since I want this to be the start of the line, I'll uncheck the label end. Then under alignment, I want to align it vertically centered and horizontally on the left. For the font, I want this to match the mark color, and I'll change it to be a little bit bigger, and I want it to be bold. And under the legend, I'll double click on one of our colors so I can reassign the colors to the values. I'd also like to add the percentage that each ring represents. So I'll add our radial LOD field into the marks and make this a text. And you can see right now it's the actual value. So I'm going to right click, go to quick table calculation, and choose percent of total. Then I'll right click format and make this a percentage with no decimals. But they're split on two lines right now. So I'm going to go to the label, edit the text, and I'll bring category first, then a colon, then the percent of total for the LOD calculation. For formatting, I'll uncheck show header for both of our axes. Then I'll format the worksheet to remove any shading. Under lines, I'll remove the grid lines, the zero lines, and the axis rulers. On a dashboard, I can now bring our radial chart in. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and then remove the legend. Then I'll resize the radial chart so it fits in our KPI card box. You can see there's still a little bit of overlap between the text and the radial rings. So I'm going to go back to the radial worksheet, and I'll use the size slider to make the rings a little bit smaller. Then under label, I'll change the font to be a little bit smaller, and I'll make it a bit more bold so it stands out more. And now we have a radial chart that shows sales segmented by category. But I also want to go a level deeper and see sales broken down by subcategory. And I'll do this by creating a rounded bar chart that has a 3-color gradients. And for design, I'm also going to add little tips on the end to make it more fun. So on a new worksheet, to start off by building the structure, I'll pull subcategory into the rows and sales into the columns. So this is how I would typically build a bar chart. But since I want it to have rounded ends, I'm going to pull measure values into the columns instead. Then I'll remove some measure values so I can see the bottom. I'll type 0 in there, and then I'll remove all the measure values that I don't need. That way we're left with just 0 and the sales. And I'll pull sales down so that 0 is first. Then under the marks, I'm going to change this to a line. And I'll make the measure names the path of the line. For size, I can use the size slider in the marks to increase or decrease the size of our rounded bars. And for color, since I want to do a 3-color gradients, I'm going to move measure names into the marks and change this to color. So you can see how this gives us a 2-color gradients. To add that third color, I'm going to type the sales divided by 2 into the measure values. Then I'll move this between 0 and sales. Here I did a 3-color gradients by using 0 and the metric as the ends of the gradients, and the metric divided by 2 as the middle. But you can also do this with even more colors. So if I wanted a 4-color gradients, instead of dividing the metric by 2, I would add the metric divided by 3 and the metric multiplied by 2/3. That way I'm creating 4 evenly spaced points that I can color. And now that I've assigned some colors to our points to create this gradients, I also want to add end shapes to the bars. This is purely for the design of it and not the functionality. One option, which is the easier option but it's not as dynamic, is to type the sum of sales plus a constant into the columns. So I'm going to try out 4,000 and see what that gives me. Then I'll right-click on one of our columns and make it a dual axis. Then right-click on one of the axes and synchronize them. And the measure names are not necessary for this mark, so I'm going to remove them. Then I'll change this from a line to a shape. And under shapes, I'm going to choose a triangle that points to the right. But you can do this with any other shape, even a shape you loaded, to get a cool effect for the end of the bars. And these triangles are looking a bit big, so I'm going to go to the size slider in the marks to decrease the size of the triangles. And under color, I'm going to choose a color that matches the end of our bars. And under the first mark, I'm going to make the size of the bars themselves a little bit bigger. And because we union the data for the orbit and radial charts, I'm going to search table name and bring that into the filters so we're looking at just one table. This first option works great if your data is static and it doesn't change much over time. Because the problem with this is that when I pull in a filter like segment and I look at just one segment, you can see that the lines are really far from the shapes. And while the distance between the line and the shape is equal distant for each subcategory, because we're using a constant, the magnitude of the values will determine the distance between the bars and the end shapes. So if you want to create a dynamic view where no matter what the values are or what's being filtered, the bars will have the same distance to the shape, we'll need to use our magnitude of the values in the adjustment. That way it's taken into account and won't affect the distance. To do this, I'll create a calculated field since it's going to be a little bit longer, so I don't want to type it directly into the pill. I'll call this the sales adjustment for the end shape. And in here, I'll do an LOD function. So I'll type holding fixed the table name, comma the segment, comma the subcategory, take the sum of sales. This is essentially identifying the sum of the sales for each subcategory, and it allows us to filter by the 2 fields that we put at the beginning, table name and segment. Then I'll add, holding fixed the table name, the segment, the sum of sales, divided by 400. This gives us an adjuster field that takes into account the total sales holding fixed our filters, which are table name and segment. So anything I'd want to be able to filter by, I would add to these LOD formulas for our adjuster field. Then I'll drag this field in to replace our existing adjuster field. And now you can see when I filter for a specific segment, the values in the chart change, but for each subcategory, there's equal distance between the bars and the shapes, even when I remove the segment filter. For formatting, I'm going to go ahead and remove the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet and change the font to be white, make it a bit larger, and have it be Tableau bold so it sticks out. For shading, I'm going to remove the shading for the worksheet. And I'll remove the row divider and the column divider for the borders. For the lines, I'll get rid of the 0 lines for the sheet and the grid lines for the columns. And you can see on here there's a little bit of space between the bar and the arrow, but because the actual box I'm going to put this in is going to be less wide, there should be less space. I'll remove the legend and hide the title. Then I'll set it to fill the entire view and resize it so it fits in our box. I'm also going to hide the field label since I already have subcategory as a title for this box. And you can see that the shapes did adjust, so we get this interesting tipped effect to the bars. This was just for the design, but I like making my dashboards stand out by adding effects, like a 3-color gradients or changing the end shape of the bar. The next element I'll add to this dashboard is a reverse gradient area chart with circle markers representing sales over time. To create this area chart, I'll need to create 3 calculated fields. So I'll create a calculated field for our normalized metric. In here I'll type the sum of sales minus the window minimum of the sum of sales, and I'll put these in parentheses. Then I'll divide the window max of the sum of sales minus the window minimum of the sum of sales. This formula scales the sales values to a range between 0 and 1, where 0 is the minimum sales in the view and 1 is the maximum. Since the second field we'll create is similar to our normalized metric, I'm going to duplicate our normalized metric field. Then I'll edit the copy and I'll call this normalized date. And everywhere there's a sales field, I'll replace this with the order date field. And everywhere there's a sum, I'll replace it with minimum. And the third calculated field I'll create will be for the reverse metric. This will just be 1 minus the normalized metric field. To create the structure, I'll pull our normalized date into the columns, and our normalized metric into the rows, and the reverse metric into the rows. Then I'll search order date within our fields, and drag that into the all marks. It's in year currently, so I'm going to right-click and choose exact date. Then I'll right-click again to make it discrete. For our table calculations, I'll right-click on norm date, go to compute using, and choose order date. And I'll do this for all 3 fields. For the normalized metric mark, I'm going to change this from automatic to align. For the second reverse metric mark, I'm going to change this from automatic to an area. Then I'll right-click on one of our metrics and make it a dual axis. And you can see here there's a lot of lines, and that's because I need a filter for order date, because this is taking the order date for all the data within our data set. So I'm going to choose to do a relative filter and look at the last 3 weeks. Then I'll edit our reverse metric axis and have a custom fixed start between -0.05 and 1.05. Under scale, checked reversed. For the norm metric axis, I'll edit it and give it that same custom range between -0.05 and 1.05. Then I'll right-click on the norm metric axis and move the marks to the front. And we don't need measure names in our marks anymore, so I'll remove those. To get a gradient effect for the part below the line, I'll go to the Map tab at the top, choose Background Images, and select our data source. Then I'll add an image and choose a gradient image I have saved on my computer. And you can see this image is a gradient that has a blue color at the bottom, and it gets lighter as it goes to the top. So this is a reverse gradient compared to what I would typically do, where it starts dark at the top and gets lighter as it goes down. For the X field, I'll have norm date be between 0 and 1. And for the Y field, I'll choose the norm metric between 0 and 1. Under options, I like to uncheck locking the aspect ratio. So you can see how that gave us a gradient background for everything that's below the line. To make this a reverse looking gradients, I'll go to color in the second marks. And I'll choose a color that matches the bottom of the graph. That way our area chart, which is the part above the line, matches the same color as the beginning of our gradients. Under the first mark, I'm going to change the color to be a white. Then to get rid of that little extra space, I'm going to go to the halo effect and choose none. And I can use the size slider in the mark to make the line thicker. For formatting, I'm going to remove all three of our headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and under borders, I'll remove the row divider and the column divider. For the lines, I want to remove the 0 lines for the sheet. On a dashboard, I'll add our area chart worksheet and hide the title. You can see there's a white space that surrounds our area chart. To get rid of this, I'm going to right-click Format, go to Shading, and choose None for the worksheet shading. Then I'll reposition our area chart. And while this is useful at showing a trend, I want to see what time period this trend is over. So I'm going to create a new worksheet called Axis. And adding an axis is super easy. So I'll just pull order date into our columns. And I want to see the actual days, so I'm going to right-click and choose Day. But you can see this is for the full time frame and not what we filtered for. So I'll go back to our area chart worksheet, right-click on our order date filter, go to Apply to Selected Worksheets, and choose our Access worksheet. Then back on our Access worksheet, you can see that the dates on here align with what we have in our area chart. And to get rid of these little lines, I'll make our marks a polygon. Then I'll right-click and edit our axis so I can get rid of the axis title. So now we're left with just the dates for the axis. I'll go back to our dashboard and add our axis worksheet. I'll hide the title and then resize it to be under our area chart. And I also want to set this from standard to the entire view. Then I'll right-click and format the axis so that I can change the shading to match the shading of our background box. And for the font, I want this to be white, a little bit bigger, and bold so it stands out. And I also want to make the tick marks white as well so they stand out a little more. To get rid of that other little white line, I'll right-click Format, go to Shading, and change the worksheet shading to None. This next step is purely for the design of it, but I want to add some markers to our area chart. And since it's going to have such a similar structure to our actual area chart, I'm going to right-click on our area chart worksheet and hit Duplicate. I'll call this area chart Markers. And since this isn't going to use gradients, I can remove our reverse metric field. And since I don't want to mess with the coloring in our other area chart worksheet, I'm going to duplicate our norm date field. So I'll call this norm date marker. And I'll drag this into the columns to replace our existing field. And I'll do this twice. Then I'll right-click on the field, go to Compute Using, and choose the order date. And I'll do this for both. And to get these on the same axis, I'm going to right-click on one of them and choose Dual Axis. For the first mark, I'm going to change this from a line to a circle. And this will be the inside of the circle, so I'm going to choose a blue color that matches our background. For the second mark, I'll also change this to a circle. And for the color, I'm going to choose a orange color so you can see how it looks. So if I use the size slider, I can increase the size of our circle so you can see it peeking behind the blue. They're a little bit off-centered right now, and that's because I need to right-click on one of our axes and synchronize them. And that gives us an outline for our original circle. So now I'm going to change the color of our outline to be white. We can't see it in here, but we'll see it once we put it against a blue background. Then I'll remove the headers since we no longer need them. For formatting, I'll also remove the grid lines. Then on our dashboard, I'll add our markers worksheet. I'll hide the title and I'll position the markers so that they're aligned with our existing gradient area chart. And this is super small, but you can see there's a tiny little white line that goes above our axis. I don't like that, so I'm going to right-click Format, format the lines, and remove the axis rulers for the rows. I also want users to be able to pick the time frame for this trend, and I want to do this using an interactive start and end date slider. To do this, I'll go to our area chart worksheet and edit our order date filter to use a range of dates rather than a relative date. But you can see this is a big time frame from 2021 to 2024. So our area chart looks a bit cluttered right now. To limit the dates that are included in our slider, I'm going to right-click on our order date field to duplicate it. I'll call this Order Date Filter. I'll pull this into the filters and choose a relative date. And I only want the slider to include the last 3 quarters relative to today. Then I'll right-click on our new filter and go to Apply to Selected Worksheets. And I'll check off all the worksheets that I want the order date slider to affect. On a dashboard, I'll go to the worksheet that we applied the filter on. Then I'll click the little down arrow, go to Filters, and choose the second order date. But you can see the values are still from 2021 to 2024. So I'll hit the down arrow on the filter and choose only relevant values. And I'll move the slider around a little to adjust or reset it. And I'll do this for both the start and end date, since this dataset includes dates in the future. And now the options within our slider are only for the past 3 quarters. For formatting, I'll right-click to uncheck Title. Then I'll move it into this little box I have. To change the font, I'll use the down arrow and format the filters. And for the body, I'm going to choose a black color and make it Tableau medium so it sticks out a little bit more. Then I'll add a text object and I'll type the word to in there. I'll change this to Tableau medium and black to match our filter criteria. Then I'll move this in between our start and end date. And because we union the data for the orbit chart and the radial chart, I'll go back to our area chart worksheet and pull in table name and filter for just one table. And just to cover bases, I'm going to right-click on the filter, go to Apply to Selected Worksheets, and choose our marker worksheet and our axis. And now we have a gradient area chart with circle markers to represent sales over time. And users have the option to filter using the slider to show what time frame this trend is over. This last box will be for order details, so I'm going to create a new worksheet called Table. In here, I'm going to include some information about our orders. So I'll start by pulling order ID into the rows. I'm also going to pull in the category and the subcategory. And I want to add some metrics where the ABC is here. So I'll start by double-clicking on quantity. And you can see that I added it to the marks and replaced the ABC with the actual quantity. And I also want to add the measure discount, so I'm going to double-click on our discount field. And that automatically put measure names in the columns and the measure values in the marks, where our 2 measure values are discount and quantity. But you can see the discount here can be higher than 1, and that doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to search for table name and add that to our filters so that we're only looking at 1 table. And now we're not double counting our measure values. But instead of it being the discount percent, I want to get the dollar amount for discount. So I'm going to create a calculated field called discount dollar. And I'll say if the discount equals 0, then 0. Else, do the sales times the discount percentage. And this will give us the discount amount in dollars. So I'll go ahead and replace our discount field with our discount dollar field. And I want these in dollars, so I'm going to right-click on our discount dollar field and format. And for the number formatting, I'll choose a custom currency with no decimals. On a dashboard, I'll go ahead and add our table worksheet. I'll hide the title, and then I'll format the worksheet to remove the shading. And I'll also remove the row banding for both the pane and the header. Under font, I'm going to choose a white font and make it Tableau semi-bold so it sticks out a bit more against our orange background. And for the borders, I'm going to make the row divider pane white and the column divider pane white. Then I'll resize our table so it fits within our box. And you can see there's some empty space here on the right, so I'm going to change this from standard to fit width. And now I can scroll down to see all the values within our table. One option for adding the grand total to a table is going to the Analysis tab at the top, Totals, and Show Grand Totals. But you can see I have to scroll all the way to the bottom to get to the grand total. So instead, I'm going to make the grand totals frozen. And there's a few ways we can do that, but I'm going to use the method that has the most customization options to it. So first I'll go back to our table worksheet and I'll remove the grand totals that we placed on here. Then I'll right-click our table worksheet and duplicate it, and I'll call this grand total. And to get the grand totals displayed, I'm going to remove all the dimensions I have in the rows. When we remove all the dimensions, Tableau is aggregating the data at the highest level, so it'll show the grand total. I'll then go back to the dashboard and bring this worksheet on. I'll hide the title and position it to be at the bottom of the table. Then I'll right-click on our headers so that I can remove them. And I'll also set this to fit the width. And now that I've aligned the grand total below our table, I can customize how I want the grand total shown. So I'm going to bring in a text box and type total. I'll change this to be black font and Tableau medium. Then I'll drag this under our table to be aligned with the totals. And because this is just a text object, I can go to the Layout tab and change the background color to be the same color as our scroll bar. Then I'll resize it so it fits across the entire table. For the grand totals, I'm going to hit the down arrow on the worksheet, and for the floating order, I'm going to bring it to the front. Then I'll right-click Format so I can make the text black to match our total text. Then I'll play with the positioning. And now users don't have to scroll all the way to the bottom to see grand totals. Instead, it's just displayed at the bottom as a frozen grand total. But you can see there's some empty space up here, so I want to add a search bar. Go back to our table worksheet and create a calculated field. I'll call this the search feature. In here, I'll type anything that I want people to be able to search for. So I'll start with customer name and do a plus sign between each field that I want to add. So I'll add country, region, and any attribute that I can think of. And once I have all these fields in here with a plus sign between them, I'll hit OK and bring our search feature into the filters. You can see here it basically concatenated each of these fields to create a giant string. So I'm going to click Use All and OK. Back on the dashboard, I'll go to the worksheet that I have added the search feature to. I'll click the down arrow, go to Filters, and add the search feature. And to get this to be easily searchable, I'm going to use the down arrow for the filter and choose Wildcard Match. And now I can use the search feature to look for a keyword like art within any of the fields that I added into our calculated field. While the search feature is fully functional at the moment, I think we can make it look a bit better. So I'll start off with right-clicking to hide the title. Then I'll change the dimensions so that I can actually see the whole worksheet. I'll resize it a bit, and then on the dashboard tab, I'm going to drag in an image. I'll choose this file that I created in Canva, but I have other options that I'll add in the description with different colors. So I'm going to start off with this orange one since it matches our table color. And then I'll drag this search bar image into the space that I want to use it. And for our actual search feature, I'm going to hit the down arrow, go to floating order, and bring it to the front. Then I'll position the search image and put the search feature inside of it. This is super picky, but I don't like the gray outline that surrounds the search feature. So I'm going to drag in a text box object. I'll hit OK because I don't need any text in there. And then under layout, for the background, I'm going to choose white. And I'll reposition this so that it covers that top border. Then I'll copy and paste, and I'll drag it down so it covers the bottom border. I'll copy paste again, and I'll do the same thing covering the side borders. And in presentation mode, you can see what that looks like now. And I can search for information that's not even in the table, like a name of a salesperson, or a state like Texas. But you can see it's not affecting our grand totals at the bottom, and that's because it's on a different worksheet. So I'm going to go back to our table worksheet, right-click on our search feature filter, go to Apply to Selected Worksheets, and check off the grand total worksheet. And now when I search for a customer name like Sarah Brown, it filters the table for all the order details that went to Sarah Brown. And the grand total shows us the total discount that that customer has had and the total quantity that they've ordered. The last thing I want to add to this dashboard are tabs at the top that allow users to filter by segment, or they can see all segments at once. To create these tabs, I would need to unionize the data, but we've already done that for the orbit and radial chart, so I don't need to do it again. The union data allows us to build a tab that's for all segments. First, I need to create a parameter. I'll call this tabs and change the data type to a string. For the allowable values, I'll choose a list. I'll add these values from our segment field. And then in the bottom, I'll type the text all. So these are all the options that users can filter for. I'll right-click to show this parameter on the worksheet. And there are two calculated fields we'll need to create for these tabs. This first one we called segment plus all. I'll say if our table name contains the text 1, then our segment field, else the text all. Because our data is union, I'm allowing one table to be sectioned off for all, and the other table to be split up by segment. I'll create another calculated field for tab-select. This field will tell us whether the tab is selected or not. I'll type if the tabs parameter equals the segment plus all calculated field, then true, else false. To build the structure, I'll move our segment plus all field into the columns. And you can see all four values that we want the tabs to represent. I'll pull the tab-select field into the marks and the segment plus all field into the marks. Then I'll change the marks to a shape. And I want the tab select field to determine the shape. And I'll make the segment plus all field a label. And you can see how they're a little off-centered, so I'm going to go to the label and the marks and make them horizontally centered. And instead of using a square and circle shape, I'm going to edit the legend so I can pick some tabs. I loaded these into my shapes, but I have another video on how to load custom shapes. For false, I'm going to choose a lighter colored tab, and for true, I'm going to choose a darker colored tab. Then using the size slider and the marks, I can increase the size of our tabs. I created these images in Canva, and I wanted them to look like filing tabs. But you can choose any shape that you want. And we don't need the header, so I'm going to right click and uncheck Show Header. Then I'll format the worksheet and go to Borders to remove the row dividers. For the text within the tabs, I'll go to Label in the marks and edit the font so it's bold. On a dashboard, I'll add our tabs in. I'll hide the title and then set this to the entire view. I'll remove the parameter and the legend since we don't need them anymore. And I'll position the tabs so that they're above the rest of our dashboard. You can see when I put it directly above the other elements on our dashboard, the white covers up part of our dashboard. So I'm going to right-click Format and go to Shading and remove the shading on the worksheet. And you might have to play with the size a little bit to get it how you like. And we set this up with a parameter so that we can use a parameter action to change the value within. And this will determine the color of the tabs. To create this action, I'll go to the Dashboard tab at the top and hit Actions. I'll add a Change Parameter action, and I'll call this Tabs. For the source sheet, the only sheet I want checked off is the Tabs worksheet. I'll target the Tabs parameter and use the Segment plus All as the source field. So now when I click on a tab, you can see the value of that tab changes from false to true, and the color changes from a light tab to a dark tab. And the last thing we need to do here is actually apply our filter to the worksheets. So I'll start off with an example of a standard worksheet that doesn't use a union. So for KPI values, I'm going to pull our Segment plus All field into the filters. Then I'll choose to use a condition and do it by formula. I'll type Segment plus All equals our tabs parameter. And I'm going to remove table name from here since we no longer need that. Now you can see when I use the tabs to filter, it filters the KPI values. So I'm going to go back to our KPI values worksheet, right click on our Segment plus All filter, and go to Apply to Selected Worksheets. And I'll check off all the worksheets that don't use a union. That way our tabs actually filter those worksheets. And I'll quickly go through and just remove table name from any of the worksheets that don't use a union. And now our tabs correctly filter for all the worksheets that don't use a union. For worksheets that do use a union, like the Orbit or Radial Chart, we'll need to set up a calculated field to filter. So I'll go to our Orbit Sales worksheet, and I'll create a calculated field called Tab Filter for the union sheets. In here I'll type our segment field plus the text All. So you can see when I bring this into our filters, it just took our segment and added the text All on the end. Then I'll choose to do a condition again and by formula. And for this I'll do contains the tab filter for the union sheets, comma the tabs parameter. And since we have more than one worksheet that uses a union, I'm going to right click on the filter and go to Apply to Selected Worksheets. I'll check off our other Orbit chart and our Radial chart. And when I filter now, you can see everything is adjusting for the filter except the Radial chart. And that's because we use an LOD calculation for our Radial chart. And we didn't initially account for segment within our LOD, so I'm going to go back to our Radial chart worksheet. Then I'll edit our LOD formula and I'll add segment to the LOD. Now when I filter for segment using the tabs, you can see it updates every single chart or graph within our dashboard.